Alternative narrative emerges in conservative media as Russia inquiry widens. Washington, Big League Politics, a new website founded by former employees of Breitbart News, had plenty to write about this week that had nothing to do with the activities of Robert S. Mueller III, the special counsel. There were several articles on Democrats with connections to high-profile men accused of sexual harassment, like Harvey Weinstein and Kevin Spacey. One cited a report that Hillary Clinton had set up the Trump Tower meeting last year, where a Russian lawyer hoped to interest Donald Trump Jr. in dirt on Mrs. Clinton. Another claimed that protesters carrying a pro-pedophilia sign participated in a demonstration that targeted a pro-Trump conspiracy theorist, Mike Cernovich. This week, as Mr. Mueller made his first significant public moves in his inquiry, announcing charges against 3 advisors to Donald J. Trump's presidential campaign, an alternative narrative was not hard to find in the conservative news media. Be it Fox News, talk radio, or the growing number of websites that write about politics from a Trump-friendly point of view, the focus was on what they see as the scandal and wrongdoing of President Trump's political opponents. In reports like these, Bill and Hillary Clinton are prominent and recurring characters because they are considered the real conspirators working with the Russians to undermine American democracy. The coverage seems to have a receptive audience in Mr. Trump, who unleashed on Friday a Twitter torrent against Mrs. Clinton, accusing her of a litany of crimes that included destroying evidence, aiding a foreign adversary, and rigging the Democratic primaries against her opponent, Senator Bernie Sanders of Vermont. Everybody is asking why the Justice Department and FBI isn't looking into all of the dishonesty going on with crooked Hillary and the Dems, he wrote. The accusations of corruption target different aspects of the Clintons and their 3 decades on the national political scene. But one primary objective of many of the stories circulating on the right seems clear: to discredit Mr. Mueller and his inquiry to the point that Americans come to see it as the partisan witch hunt Mr. Trump insists that it is. Opening his radio show the other day, the host Mark Levin called Mr. Mueller and his investigators a gang of radical leftists. Shut it down, blared a headline on a Big League Politics article, referring to Thomas J. Fitton, the president of the conservative advocacy group Judicial Watch, who declared the inquiry out of control. Writing for National Review, Andrew McCarthy accused Mr. Mueller of overstepping his authority in bringing charges against Paul Manafort, Mr. Trump's former campaign chairman, and Rick Gates, Mr. Manafort's deputy. He called the indictments shaky and overcharged, and an example of an abusive prosecutorial tactic that flouts congressional intent. Much of this news coverage in the last several days has focused on 2 reports that Mr. Trump's defenders say point to evidence that Mrs. Clinton and her campaign benefited from cultivating ties to Russians. The first stems from a New York Times article in 2015 that said that, while Mrs. Clinton was serving as Secretary of State, the Obama administration approved the sale of a controlling interest in Uranium One, a company based in Canada that had uranium holdings in the United States, to a Russian atomic energy agency. The deal, the article said, benefited not just Russia, but the men who helped build the company, major donors to the Clinton Foundation. Some of the connections between Uranium One and the Clinton Foundation were unearthed by Peter Schweizer, a former fellow at the right-leaning Hoover Institution, who provided some of his reporting to the Times, which scrutinized the information and built upon it with its own reporting. But the coverage received renewed attention this month after an article in The Hill said that the FBI had been looking into evidence around that time, when Mr. Mueller was at the FBI, that Russians were engaged in bribery so they could expand their energy interests in the United States. Mr. Trump called it Watergate, modern age. The State Department has said that decisions to approve deals like the one in question generally do not rise to the level of the secretary, meaning it is unlikely that Mrs. Clinton would have known anything about it. And the uranium in question is not exported for use overseas, meaning that Russians could not use it for nuclear weapons. The second report that Mr. Trump's defenders have seized on was the disclosure that the Democratic National Committee and Mrs. Clinton's presidential campaign, through their law firm, paid for research that was included in a dossier that contained salacious claims about connections between Mr. Trump, his associates and Russia. A conservative website backed by a major Republican donor first